as soon as a society loses this ability to advance a living tradition of knowledge and is merely preserving just the pattern of behavior, it's like a timer.
You're just like, how long can you stave off entropy?
Exactly. And that is a doomed battle. What does it matter if we have something called a university? If a truly unusual thinker with a deep interest in knowledge cannot make a career doing unexplainable things for unexplainable reasons and occasionally showing up with a miracle. Maybe in our quest to make knowledge legible too early, we sometimes destroy what makes it viable.
Hello, friends, and welcome to the Win-Win podcast. Today, I'm speaking to Samo Burja. Samo is a political analyst, historian, and sociologist. He's both a researcher at the Long Now Foundation and the founder of Bismarck Analysis, a consulting firm that gathers in-depth intelligence on the political and institutional landscape of society. But he's probably best known for his writing, particularly on the rise and fall of civilizations, a topic which dominates a large part of our conversation today, and more specifically, what lessons we can draw from their collapse about our current society's issues, the nature of power, the importance of social technologies, how to spot signs of institutional rot, and the importance of great founders even in today's modern age. Lots of juicy stuff. Let's dig in. So, Samo, you're many things. You're a sociologist, a historian, political analyst. But I think the area of your work that I find most fascinating is your study of how previous civilizations collapse. So I'm curious to hear any common threads between all the different types of civilizational collapses. And are there any commonalities that you've noticed?
Well, first off, I have to acknowledge that there are, in fact, many theorists of civilizational collapse, and many people have written about this, actually, for centuries. There are a few favorite theories, and we could dive into all of those. But if I give my account and sort of my summary on top of much that's happened, is that I think the key difficulties of most societies are sociopolitical, in the sense that perhaps most societies, for most of human history, have been literal pyramid schemes, not just in the sense that, say, a Bronze Age civilization might build some pyramids, but in the sense that it requires constant growth and novel inputs, right? Novel inputs of resources, novel inputs of manpower, honestly, sometimes novel infusions of knowledge. One of the more interesting aspects to me is that in our civilization, let's call this Western civilization, though one could argue, for example, that around the 1880s, the sort of old Western civilization gave way to a new type of industrial and scientific civilization. One could make that argument. But let's say that there's continuity. We tend to believe so much in progress. Either progress is good or progress is bad, and it's like leading us to ruin. And we don't pay very much attention to the long epochs of history where knowledge actually regresses. It's not even just there is a sudden collapse, but you might have centuries of stasis or slowly abandoning various technologies that previously were economical and under changed conditions are no longer reasonable to sustain. You stop building aqueducts not because the Germanic invaders are always burning them down. You stop building aqueducts because your cities have emptied out and they have a fraction of the wealth and the population that they used to. So it is completely uneconomical to build novel structures like that. And once you haven't built one in 100 or 200 years, well, you don't know how to build one, right? All technology lives in socioeconomic niches where it's sustained by humans, right? Human hands, human labor, and maybe eventually we'll get to the point of self-sustaining technology. If I were being playful, I would say that domesticated plants and animals are the closest we have to self-sustaining technology that's truly a ratchet, right? If a new breed of horse is domesticated, right? And for some reason, our civilization stops using horses, a few of them are likely still to escape. And then whatever wild type of horse, like say in Australia, right, the Brumby, or in North America, I think we even had camels escape at some point, and New Mexico and created a wild population, that biological organism will persist whatever innovations we bred into it for long after our society is gone.
So you're pointing at that one of the key drivers of civilizational collapse is loss of knowledge. So what are the main mechanisms of this knowledge loss? Like, for example, you mentioned the aqueducts in Rome. You seem to be hinting at something that it's like, is it that knowledge, you need to find a way to keep knowledge passing down from generation to generation? And is it because they didn't have sufficient technology to write that knowledge down? Or is there a different flavor of knowledge that's being lost?
I would say that nearly all of our knowledge is actually tacit and unwritten knowledge.
What do you mean by tacit?
Procedural, almost a matter of habit. If we were to attempt to write down the procedure used at a TSMC chip fab for the manufacture of a particular set of chips, I'm sure we could write very long books that would be very helpful, yet you would still need experts with actual experience to run the procedure successfully. No matter how much you document, there's always more left to document. And carrying out those operations with high reliability and having a functional division of labor and human specialization, which, mind you, all technologies require extensive human specialization. I don't know of any technology that does not require extensive human specialization. This is, by the way, even true of so-called Stone Age societies, right? So if you look at the Neolithic or even the Paleolithic, you will have archaeological evidence of long-distance trade where people will dig up a particularly useful rock deposit, make workshops to make little flint knives, and then those flint knives might find their way 200 or 300 miles away, being traded by one tribe to the other. So when we think of globalization in a way, maybe it truly started in the Stone Age, and even in the Stone Age, to produce the stone axes, spears, tips, pottery, extensive specialization was already required, right? So again, what does it mean to require specialization for a piece of technology to function? You've heard the argument that, no one knows how to make a pencil, right? And, this is usually introduced as like a metaphor about the market, but it goes to non-market societies too. It is this clear argument that deep specialization between different humans is needed. What does this mean? It means that every piece of technology is secretly also a coordination problem. I mean, arguably Boeing is learning this as we speak, with doors falling off of their planes. I don't expect this is the end of commercial air travel, though it might be an early stage in the end of Boeing as a particular company. And if Boeing was the only company in the world, if there wasn't an Airbus and, for a variety of reasons, new competitors could not enter the market, we very well might live to see a civilization that abandons mass commercial air travel. Consider the following scenario. Drones displace human-piloted aircraft as the main mode of air power, thereby making the difference between a military plane and a commercial passenger plane much greater, right? You no longer have this like dual-use nature of the aerospace industry, meaning major countries no longer subsidize their aerospace industry, including France, the United States, maybe Russia. Add to this, perhaps, a greater emphasis on reducing CO2 emissions. So we might have a situation where the aircraft, developing new manned aircraft, is super expensive. There's no defense reason to do it. Because there's no defense reason to do it, there's no investment in improving it. We're just stuck with the 737 forever. And fuel costs, let's say, maybe go up. And then as slowly the airlines start failing and we take fewer and fewer flights, a narrative emerges. Well, we're not regressing technologically, you see, in this one domain. We are becoming more environmentally conscious. And we're saving so many tons of CO2. Actually, it's not a defeat that 1 million people fewer travel over the air this year than last year. It's a victory because think of all of the tons of CO2 we didn't emit. So one thing that very much does happen in most declining societies is a reframing of a defeat as a victory, fulfilling that socio economic niche that I alluded to earlier, very abstract concept, but elites in all societies, in all places, have victory narratives. Why? Because the victory narrative sustains paying action today with coin from the future, right? It sustains the pyramid scheme. Even if ultimately, say, the peasants or the middle class or even the lower aristocracy are the ones left, paying the bill because the next stage of the pyramid scheme never comes to be. And I think that historically, what might be an example of this? Well, your society might find itself in a very serious war. You might find yourself in a struggle between, the High German nobility and the Holy Roman Emperor. And in that situation, something like the Protestant Reformation, where you go in and you seize the gold from the churches. Well, you're not seizing gold from the churches to fund your rebellion against the emperor. That would be a bit, that would be a negative sign. It's a positive sign. We've now realized that to honor God, we don't need these golden altars at all. So we always have a reason for confiscation of resources, and we always have a reason for the confiscation of human labor. And the reason always is presented as a progression, a new evolution. So, okay, we're reforming back to true Christianity, and true Christianity means that I get all of the land of the monasteries, right? Henry VIII certainly thought so. Also that, I get any divorce I want. Henry VIII also thought so.
And it's and it's more of an austere aesthetic, because like Protestantism is very drab and so on, whereas Catholicism is very golden churches and very ornate. So it's reframed as like, no, we're closer to God, but really it was done for economic reasons, is what you're saying.
Yes, and the tax burden of, say, peasants in northern Germany and southern Germany, it was the same. So the whole argument that, if one is less sympathetic to religion, there's certainly arguments against religion, might be that, oh, isn't it terrible that the churches are so ornate and the peasants are so poor? Well, the poverty of the peasants was almost uncorrelated to the wealth of the churches, because a different extractive class filled that niche almost fully, right? Where the ultimate tax burden was about the same, actually. There's still arguments, of course, for Protestantism. I'm just noting that, say, the Christianization of the Roman Empire went along very similar lines. State property, including the pagan temples, right? The temple to Jupiter Optimus Maximus, all that beautiful gold. Well, once we convert to Christianity, that is all part of my war chest. That is all part of the imperial treasury and can be used for defense or other public works. So I do think that there is this very much pattern where a social reform that simplifies society, which might be necessary in important ways, can be used to fund or support almost any kind of effort. And again, the intentional recycling of late antiquities, architectural and artistic patrimony, that actually was the main mechanism of the destruction of Roman cities. It was not so much Attila the Hun burning down a city. It was the Romans themselves recycling old buildings for building material and melting down bronze statues to pay coin for the soldiers.
So what was the specific things or set of things that precipitated, that pushed them into doing that? Was it because you mentioned that like there were fewer people in the cities? Was it a kind of demographic collapse?
I think that there is a substantial amount of demographic collapse ongoing in the Western Roman Empire. In the Eastern Roman Empire, less so. And the evidence for this is significant. There are historians who have tried to argue that there was not that much of a population collapse, but honestly, their arguments are fairly weak. We have decent numbers for population of cities where the urban landscape shrinks generation after generation. Meanwhile, the evidence of, let's say, higher density of habitation in the countryside is very scant. So the obvious conclusion is the population is dropping. This is hardly unique for Rome, and it's not unique even for the modern world. Actually, for nearly any point in the last 9,000 years of human history, cities have always been population sinks. People move into a city, they work in a city, they usually love life in the city. Almost any era you read, people experience entering a city as liberation, right? They find cities very socially stimulating, right? I think we find them addicting. As anyone who has friends who ever lived in New York knows, it's sort of like a toxic ex. They never get over it. They never get over the experience of living in a truly dynamic city. And they will always bring it up somewhere or another, right? The same was true of Ur or Uruk in ancient Sumeria. If you read the Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, one of the oldest texts we have, you have this, a wild man, Enkidu, who is, out there happily in the forests hunting animals, and eventually he falls. There's a lady that comes seek him out on behalf of a dream, like a temple priestess. They have a bunch of sex, and then the animals just don't like how he smells. So the poor guy has to go to the city. In the city, he gets completely wasted on beer. He gets into pointless fights. And then at one point, the king of the city, who kind of arranged for him to be brought in the city in the first place, notices him. And he's like, wow, you have martial valor. You should be my bodyguard. And then they go on these fun bromance adventures and seek immortality and all of that. But if we read under the surface, what is it talking about? It's talking about, you go to the city, you might become an alcoholic, you're going to be a menace, but you kind of like living in the city, and hunting just seems so unappealing. Like the hunter-gatherer lifestyle, even if you were wealthier in some way, just starts being super unappealing. And there are, less fictional accounts where the Sumerians are sort of like looking down on the recent arrivals into their cities who are all of these other peoples who are working in the cities, and they're like, you can't even write your name down, okay? You're like not really my equal. I'm literate. You're just here to do some menial labor. And I think it's very telling that that was already a basic civilizational dynamic 7,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago. And we could transport this story almost anywhere. 19th century Britain, 16th century China, 1st century Rome.
What role did indigenous knowledge loss play in some of these civilizations? Because while I was researching this, I was reading about, I didn't realize just to the extent how much knowledge we've lost, like the terra preta soils, if you're familiar with those.
Yes, in South America.
Yeah, in the Amazon, there are these very dark, incredibly fertile soils that are not actually naturally occurring, and seem like they, from around 400 years BC, indigenous cultures were mixing charcoal and bone meal and compost and so on into these otherwise very infertile soils around the Amazon and making it so that you could actually settle. And then when the Spanish colonizers came along, it broke up the indigenous cultures sufficiently such that the knowledge of how to make those soils was supposedly lost.
There's an argument that the introduction of disease caused a population collapse, which caused some of these areas to be abandoned. However, I would note that civilizations in the New World had collapsed long before the Spanish as well, right? The Mayan civilization essentially ended long before the Spanish conquest of the New World, right? And, there have been many studies recently where what they do is they fly drones over the jungle, and the drones use LiDAR, basically laser radar, to peek under the jungle canopy. And what they found was these vast sites, something like 20,000 sites of various cities of great size. And this has caused historians to revise upward the total population of Mayan civilization, Mayan cities from these early centuries AD. So this is sometimes literally 1,000 years before the Spanish arrived. I think that the kind of agricultural collapse that we might see in, say, South and Central America, caused by the introduction of European diseases and also, conquest, or rather old world diseases, that's probably happened before, sometimes just to internal developments. The Aztecs themselves have a legend, essentially, that they came up from the north, maybe from here in Texas or New Mexico or Arizona, and invaded previous societies, setting up their priestly system with the human sacrifice pyramid. Once again, a pyramid scheme where you extort the other tribes for your human tribute that sustains kind of your theocracy in place. And the old world has analogs as well. I mentioned earlier the Sumerians, right? when the Semitic peoples, the Babylonians, and so on, first arrive into Mesopotamia, modern day Iraq, they're basically totally barbarians as well. They're like, they're sort of these pastoralist people that barely understand like the concept of living in a city. And all of the big cities are essentially abandoned. This is around 2000 BC. Most of the big cities are abandoned. And people pick up the titles of, oh, I'm the great king of Ur. And then how you can tell that this title is kind of fake is because the great king of Ur used to have an army of 5,000 people. And then you have this guy bragging with clearly a not very educated scribe, because the Sumerian text is kind of bad, about having 100 guys. And then you're like, wait, the scale of your society has decreased massively, but you still put on airs and pretensions of something greater. And in that period, a large chunk of Mesopotamia became basically grazing ground. So when you think about, nomadic horse peoples in around 1000 AD, rummaging through Eurasia, sort of toppling societies, stuff like that has happened before. Agriculture is adopted and abandoned many times through human history.
What role do the institutions of a civilization play?
Nearly all institutions are these very deeply inherited and, developed patterns of human behavior, right? They are, in a way, an instantiation of social technology, which we could contrast with material technology, right? I earlier pointed out that, say, a 737 or a TSMC chip fab are as much feats of coordination as they are feats of raw technical knowledge. That already shows that to make such products, you always have to have concrete systems of human organization supporting them. So institutions have to be varied because the needs of society are very varied. And what is necessary to maintain a city or an industrial base of a modern kind or an agricultural civilization of, some of the types we've discussed so far, those needs are very varied. Institutions often persist and outlive even a concrete civilization. So perhaps a useful metaphor might be that institutions are sort of the trees and the civilization is the forest. You might inherit a Roman system of law, even if you say you don't inherit Roman religion or if you don't inherit Roman urban life. But clearly, by the time you're talking about Charlemagne and Franks, this is a very different society and a different civilization than the Roman Senate and state would have been at 200 BC. So I think institutions can be considered almost sort of these units of social organization, and they are very frequently copied and very frequently renovated, and introducing a new type of institution into a society can radically transform it. I think this is one of the reasons that often the greatest periods of civilizational flourishing is when different civilizations meet and one institution is introduced from a radically different selective environment, different mimetic selective environment, different political environment, and finds a productive niche and thrives in that way. Honestly, the organization of, say, the Japanese economy, politics, and society after Meiji Restoration might be like a wonderful example of this, where Japanese society is nearly completely transformed and becomes economically extremely productive at the end of the 19th century, very quickly coming to rival the European powers that at first seemed set to colonize Japan, as they had so many other societies that they encountered.
What role does the problem of succession play? Presumably, when you've got these big institutions, whether they're corporations or legal structures, if they were created by a powerful person, when that person is dying or getting old, retiring, you need to have a way to succeed them. So was that a common theme throughout history, or is that more of a modern problem?
I think that has always been, of course, a problem, right? The transfer of very deep expertise person to person, we can break down the succession problem into almost two components, right? There's a knowledge succession problem, and then there's a power succession problem, where a knowledge succession problem is pretty straightforward. You have a master of their craft, or a great legal mind, or a great naturalist. And they come to develop deep expertise in the course of their life. To the quirks of our biology and what seems to be the biology of most life on Earth, this expertise, this crystallized intelligence that you've painstakingly built through your life that allow you to do really remarkable, maybe feats of engineering or, have a thorough, deep understanding of the legal code in your society or anything like that. All of it that allows you to function very well, actually, even as perhaps your fluid intelligence decreases through the course of your life. So even as nominally your IQ is dropping, your competence is going up, right? Finding a replacement for that, very hard. And people intuitively understand that, right? Some past societies focused on a kind of master-apprentice relationship where you would become someone's apprentice and you would sort of shadow them at their job and work a very long time, basically providing some amount of free labor to do more and more of their job. And the payout, in a way, it wasn't so much equity or salary. The payout was, you get to get the master's position eventually. And ideally, you have recreated or matched every sort of aspect of that job. Today, we might see a little bit of this also still in the academic context where having, a great doctoral advisor is still very much prized because everyone understands that the business of science is still a matter of tacit knowledge. In fact, if we went to a room of scientists right now and quizzed them, polled them on what is their theory of the scientific process, I claim you're not going to get a single answer. I think you're going to get a diversity of answers. And that really illustrates that perhaps even in our society, the true business of science still remains a practice rather than a rigorous body of theory that we apply in all circumstances. And that perhaps we first developed the practice of science and only later in the 20th century, which I'm sure you agree is well into the scientific revolution, did we start really deeply debating the theory of, why does all of this stuff even work, right? And one way to think about this is that in so many domains of our lives, once we can put something into words rigorously or into any sort of formal notation, say mathematics would, I think, be conceptually very similar, the business of knowledge transfer becomes easier. But it also suggests that whatever field of inquiry existed there has been deeply exhausted. Like once you can fully systematize something, there's actually not much left to discover. Like in physics today, if I were to study the solar system and try to get insights into gravity, with enough resources, I'm sure we could eke out a little bit more, but not that much more.
And all that low-hanging fruit has been
exactly. It's like the orbit of Mercury is already figured out. We figured out all the planets and stuff, and three-body problem, etc. You're not going to figure that out. not through a telescope, right? Watching the movement of Jupiter's moons or whatever, which
maybe with AI sims and such, yeah.
Yeah, maybe
a sim plus AI could maybe predict it a little better.
Exactly. But the point I'm making here is that in a way, maybe the most important function of knowledge succession and the succession of tacit knowledge is on the very frontiers of achievement. So it's not so much about preserving our ability to have a jet plane fly or preserving our ability to make chips in a TSMC chip fab. It might be our ability to innovate and make completely new kinds of chips or completely new kinds of aircraft. And in a way, once societies lose that due to, I think, actually a failure of tacit knowledge transfer, there's this kind of a almost intellectual dark matter where you can prove that this sort of intellectual content must exist, but it's very difficult to describe and account for all of it, right?
Oh, I see. So I'm just trying to figure the metaphor because in physics, dark matter is these galaxies are spinning this fast, they should be flying apart.
But they don't.
So that implies there must be some hidden mass that we can't we can't actually detect, but it should be there. And you're saying there's this knowledge holding our institutions together, even though we can't clearly pinpoint what it is. These things should have fallen apart long ago. So there's some kind of almost like an intellectual gravity that is enabling us to coordinate and keep these things going.
Exactly. If every piece of technology is a coordination problem, you look at all the coordination mechanisms you can explicate and systematize. I bet we don't know all of them yet. I think we're actually pretty bad at figuring out human behavior on a deep way. And once we do, I'm sure that'll be a golden age in its own right. That seems definitely enough for me to say in the big picture, that would be a totally different civilization where we truly scientifically understood the human being. I think that's what people were hoping for in 1910 or 20. If you read either the utopias or the dystopias of that period, people were so excited about Freudian psychology because they assumed that this would be a total revolution of humanity. Turned out to be less than a total revolution, right? But you can understand their enthusiasm, perhaps, or the enthusiasm for evolutionary psychology, which I think still holds some potential. In the 2010s, I well remember this feeling of excitement. We're about to figure out the human being. And who knows how our society will change, how marriage will change, property will change, how our ability to manage human violence will change, and all of this. But before we go too far afield from the initial question, I think that as soon as a society loses this ability to advance a living tradition of knowledge and is merely preserving just the pattern of behavior that produced the previous thing, it's like a timer. It's like your body has stopped making new skin cells, right? Like I'm sure the old
only one
cells.
you're just like, how long can you stave off entropy?
Exactly. And that is a doomed battle. Like you can fight it for a very long time. Like maybe the aqueducts in, say, I don't know, Constantinople in 300 or 400 or 600 AD, maybe those still work. But at some point, Constantinople is the only city that has over 1 million people in your rump of a Roman Empire, right? And Rome in the 6th century AD has 70,000 people and goats grazing in the Colosseum. It doesn't matter if you're really dedicated to preserving the heritage of your city. In fact, late Roman emperors would sometimes put laws in place against people pillaging old abandoned buildings for building material. People did that anyway, of course. It's a losing battle. And metaphorically, what does it matter if we have something called a university? If a truly unusual thinker with a deep interest in knowledge cannot make a career doing unexplainable things for unexplainable reasons and occasionally showing up with a miracle. I feel like maybe in our quest to make knowledge legible too early, we sometimes destroy what makes it viable. We try to solve the succession problem through written tests as if, for example, the many Chinese dynasties, like the Ming dynasty, had not attempted to do this. When Europeans encountered Confucian education, they were first immensely impressed because it seemed very close to their ideals. If you read 18th century Europeans, they find immensely inspiring the Confucian educational system. People like Voltaire hold it up as an example of a rational civilization, a wealthy civilization. In the 19th century, they complain about how it's all rote memorization. I think, honestly, they're both right. In the 18th century, that system still works very well. By the 19th century, that same system, as you run its internal logic and as everyone follows the incentive gradient, people come to memorize the leaked test results. And studying for the test at first is a great boon because at first you're sort of strip mining all of society for talent. And the people who mastered the test from any layer of society, they're very good at mastering anything, really. They're just very smart people. But once that process has been running for a few generations, I actually think it's inevitable that the imperial exam or the civil service exam, or let's say the entry interview, the acceptance interview for a Harvard position becomes a farce, becomes something where maybe, I don't know, your entire high school experience is choreographed to look good at that one interview at an Ivy League university. I think we're already there.
Yeah, we're almost certainly there.
We are certainly there. And I think we were not there 100 years ago, and we were not there 50 years ago.
Okay, so what are some other signs that you've noticed that suggest that we are starting to mirror some of these problems?
Well, I think that it is very telling that we have found a general disappointment in the rate of advance of most technologies outside of, let's say, anything related to the information revolution, anything related to the AI revolution. So this is the classic sort of Peter Thiel observation about bits versus atoms. Currently, the promise is that in the very near future, AI will revolutionize atoms. For now, I'm only seeing it make words. It makes words very well, makes them definitely at the level of a college undergrad. But perhaps that's an indictment of the college undergrad, as much as it is a triumph of OpenAI and Anthropic engineers, right? I think that the fact that we had millions of people, right, basically wrote essays that can be statistically predicted, just shows us how deeply we exhausted what was once a deeply intellectual exercise, right? The essay comes from the term to attempt something, right? The idea behind an attempt is that you put into words and put thoughts on paper that you've never explicitly examined before. Who can say that they truly wrote an essay of that type in high school or even college? I can point to in all my writing, I think I have something like 6 articles that truly achieve that level. And for many of the other articles, I'm just explaining what I learned from other sources or what seems to be the ultimate evaluation. And I think the fact that we were a writing-based civilization and now we're sort of almost LARPing being a writing-based civilization suggests to me we have lost huge swaths of tacit knowledge. I would even argue that the stylistic differences between scientific papers in 1920 versus 2020 suggest that we have already lost much of what was once the practice of science. Well, read a scientific paper from 1910, 1920, 1930. Pick a topic of arbitrary complexity. It can be a quantum mechanics paper even. The style is going to be much less dry than any modern paper. Even any modern paper.
It's going to be less formulaic.
It's going to be much less formulaic. It's going to be very economical with jargon. It's going to be very straightforward, very precise, but also beautiful. Why is it beautiful? It's beautiful because it's meant to be read by human beings, not committees. It's beautiful because it is a remnant of the old peer review, which we have nearly forgotten. The old peer review being, hey, I trust this person's intellectual taste. I will submit to their journal, and they will decide if they publish me in their scientific journal. If my work is bad, I'll be embarrassed in front of our scientist friends. That's old peer review. New peer review in the 20th century is the nominally meritocratic and rational committee. The problem with the committee is you must agree with every member of a committee, even if they disagree with each other. So over time, this has produced a very stilted form of writing, and it is a writing that is dreadful to read, right? Even if you're super interested in the subject matter, which means most academic papers are not read. So who are they produced for? Why are we producing so many papers? Well, it's hard to give the government a KPI for the scientific research it's funding. An easy KPI is, we have 50 researchers working on this. No, we have 500 scientists working on this. No, we have 5,000 PhDs in chemistry working on this problem. So the inflation of headcount. And you can also say, our department has published so many papers, so many scientific papers. And at one point, the scientific paper was obviously a good advancement. Now, let's note in social science, for example, we had the replication crisis go through and basically torch entire fields of knowledge. The publication of a paper is not news anymore. It's like not even news for people in the field, right? But it is a requirement to publish papers to achieve funding and to achieve accreditation, right? So that this hyper production of low quality writing, where the quality of the writing itself no longer matters, betrays that we are no longer a writing-based civilization. We just believe it's super legitimate to base authority in writing.
So it sounds like what you're getting at here is it's like a dark amalgam of excessive bureaucracy and like tyranny of metrics in terms of optimizing for those.
Goodhart's law in everything.
Exactly, Goodhart's law.
I mean, once an excellent measure becomes a target, right, it ceases to be a good measure.
Exactly. And so everything has become, before your goal was writing good papers to do good science. And then it's like, okay, but now the goal is to just write papers. And so your objective function is like gotten derailed. And you are, and yeah, so everyone is now sort of trapped in these, I call them Moloch traps, but these kind of social dilemmas where even if you don't want to be churning out just paper after paper to get funding, if you don't do it, everyone else is going to, so you have to play that game as well.
You are stuck in that equilibrium no matter what you want to do as an individual, unless, for example, if one were independently wealthy and very socially resilient, then one could fund any research they wanted or sustain themselves. But very few people do this, right? It's one of the reasons I say admire the Stephen Wolframs of the world, whatever you think of the scientific merit of some of his theories or the self-presentation. I actually think he deserves praise for trying to actually be a scientist in the way a 19th century scientist would have tried to be a scientist, right? We forget the idea of the sort of gentleman scholar, free from worldly affairs, just trying to figure out the world, right? And sometimes having a big ego. Isaac Newton had a big ego. That didn't stop anyone from taking Isaac Newton seriously. Would Isaac Newton have done well in any sort of HR department interview?
Horrible.
He would have done horribly, right? He could be positively nasty. It wasn't just like Asperger's, right? He could be viciously competitive. And I think we have come to deeply disdain the kind of personality that can actually drive new ideas. I think we have put a high premium on being very well socialized, by which we mean very conflict averse on the surface, but perhaps very conflict oriented below the surface. In our society,
right, that energy's got to go somewhere.
It has to go somewhere. In our society, any sort of physical violence, of course, is out, which, sure, okay, that seems reasonable. But even overly harsh scientific criticism is met with suspicion. Why are you upsetting the apple cart? Shouldn't we all be working together as a field? Blah, 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 blah. What are we doing? Are we collectively preserving class privilege, the class privilege of being an academic, or are we trying to discover truth? Or economic competition. Trying to do economic competition for real today will get you denounced as a ruthless businessman. When it's like, really, well, all I'm trying to do is make a good product, and we are going to try to drive our competitors out of business. If someone says that in modern corporate culture, they're like, what, top 4 percentile, top 2 percentile disagreeable among CEOs, right? Maybe top 1% even. These are all of these ways in which, of course, the fact that all of these things are punished, right? Physical violence, intellectual competition, economic competition, that of course suggests there's a lot of hidden physical violence, intellectual sabotage and economic sabotage, because otherwise, who would be punishing them, right? So there's a broader theme, I think, of we have focused very much on eliminating outliers. And we're experiencing kind of evaporative cooling in society, right? Where over time, we always lop off the right and left side of the distribution, or maybe just the right side of like a Gaussian distribution. And, not in a genetic or IQ sense, just on any sort of trait that we allow people of, various positions to have. And over time, our sense of what the proper social role is gets narrower and narrower and narrower. And we have, in the process of narrowing it, cut out huge chunks of what once made it functional to be, I don't know, the member of a corporation, right? A functioning board today is exotic, almost dangerous, almost unprecedented. Like a board that practices any oversight over a company, that's weird, right?
Like how everyone had a meltdown over that when the OpenAI board, its job is to keep an eye on the CEO, and while none of us really know what actually went down, like they clearly felt strongly enough that the CEO had done something wrong, and they took an action, and then the whole world had a meltdown about it. And it's like, that's what a board is meant to do. So the fact that that was so shocking suggests that like something has gone awry there. We expect a certain level of, what do you think? Like, was that a further example of this, or was that actually something against the trend?
I think all indicators suggest that Sam Altman is an excellent CEO, according to most metrics used in Silicon Valley. However, it's undoubtedly true that that is exactly within the authority of a board, right? A board might be wrong, but the fact that it's become so rare to have any sort of board oversight in a modern corporate body in Silicon Valley, even an unusual one like OpenAI, I think that's concerning. So even if the board was incorrect in that case, right, it still suggests we've lost the social technology of a joint stock company. We've lost the social technology of a well-governed nonprofit.
It means we've lost that feedback mechanism.
Exactly.
Basically.
It legally still exists. All of these things exist on paper. As I'm sure you know, the Roman Senate existed on paper long after it ceased to be relevant, right? In the 7th century AD, in Constantinople, you still had people going around calling themselves senators, right? Would they meet? No. Would they pass laws? No. On what stage of this change are we, say, in our political institutions? I would argue that the majority of law in the modern United States is made purely administratively. What is not made administratively is made through judicial review, and only a small amount of law is made by Congress itself, right? So when people are saying Congress doesn't do anything, yet then turn around and speak about our democracy, that's very strange. I think this will perplex future historians for much the same reason we are a bit perplexed that, Augustus is calling himself first citizen rather than just, he's obviously the emperor, okay? The Senate obviously doesn't matter. And everyone knew the Senate doesn't matter, but they drew legitimacy from long dead institutions, right? This is also another thing that happens. Over time, the maintenance of the appearance of an institution can become very vital for the political balance of a society. So you have zombie institutions going around where we need someone to fulfill a social role, and the role of a long broken institution is to stay there and pretend to be in that social role. And, I could say quip that maybe the modern United Kingdom is a bureaucracy pretending to be a democracy, pretending to be a monarchy, right? Where, any sort of democratic element, when it does have input, it's very unconsidered, very chaotic, maybe like Brexit. And, whenever any monarchical element enters, it's this very strange, untouchable thing that, however, is still there and will probably still be there 200 years from now.
I would say that I don't think the UK is pretending to be a monarchy anymore. Like no Brit thinks that the monarch actually has any meaningful power, or very few Brits do, at least. But I think they do. I do agree with you that it's, at least they still hope and believe that democracy is legitimate and playing out. So when you say it's a bureaucracy masquerading as a democracy, what are the signs that it is, what makes you think that it is no longer a functioning democracy? And was there a particular tipping point where you were like, okay, this is where it switched over? When was it last, basically?
Well, I would say that a very important point has to be that we all basically explain away the failures of elective representatives to institute any sort of change in purely personal terms. We always talk about, these politicians are corrupt, bad, not serious, co-opted by the system, and so on. Yet, obviously, anyone who makes it to those positions always has those features. The system and the whole set of incentives actively select for a certain kind of individual to go there. But the pretense we all have is that if the right individual got in, they could still do things. Why do we believe that? Why do we think that if suddenly, a different person came into Parliament or Congress, that they would be able to organize with other fellow congressmen or members of Parliament and say, I don't know, reform the intelligence community, or reform the Pentagon, or even reform, either way, the NHS, right, in Britain? I think it's very dubious that they could do that, especially in the very short amount of time they have available, especially with very limited resources in terms of even research capacity. Like, how much research capacity as to all of these difficult problems that an elective representative is supposed to have a crisp opinion on? How much capacity do they have? Who is doing that intellectual labor for them? Well, might be lobbyists, might be their political party, if they're in a particularly functional party, but they're certainly not doing it as individuals. So I'd put the tipping point around the last time you saw a representative, deliberative, legislative body where a speech was given to other members of the elected body with the primary intent to change the opinion of fellow legislators rather than the general public. Now, here's an interesting one. We're used to debates being a circus. They are there to help you be elected. It is exotic and strange for us to imagine a body where the elected officials meet and they try to persuade each other of points.
Right, and actually change people's minds.
Exactly.
Truly. Yeah. They're trying to change each other's minds to converge on a common truth.
To converge on a common truth, with each of them being a representative of the interests of their constituents. What I said sounds like Civic 101, because it is, and because it's crazy to point out that's not how it works right now, But the crazier thing is, it kind of did work that way. In 1900, 1920, I would say as late as 1960. I think in 1960, if you had a persuasive, well-argued speech in British Parliament or in Congress, people who at that point were 70 or 60 years old, who were not in touch with the incentives of their era, they would probably behave as a real deliberative body, right? And I think in the United States, an interesting point is the 1970s, which is when Congress, to some extent, attempts to both rein in the president, but also rein in the intelligence community. There's commission hearings that declassify a bunch of stuff in the United States after the Vietnam War. Of course, the impeachment also of Richard Nixon. But that's sort of the last spasm. So if we were looking at U.S. history, I think, the 1970s are a good mark. And for the United Kingdom, maybe 60s, maybe 70s.
What role do you think the sort of sense-making crisis that we are increasingly getting into could be playing as well? Because again, you've talked about how succession of knowledge, the continuation of tacit knowledge is so important. It's arguably harder to actually get a clear picture of the world now. I mean, in some ways, yes, we've got more information available than ever before. The world is more connected, but at the same time, we've got generative AI that's going to be very quickly making very convincing, politically sensitive videos if people want to, troll farms, etc. And then coupled with the fact that there's all these different sort of incentives at play to encourage newspapers to skew their headlines in favor of their existing readership and so on. So it feels like it's getting increasingly hard to get an accurate picture of the world. That seems to only go in one direction, right?
I think that absent certain important counter trends, we are seeing over time the collapse of our society's capacity for collaborative, for basically collaborative sense making in the sense that you describe, right? We are seeing over time a breakdown of our ability to process information collectively. So we used to greatly rely on a relatively healthy epistemic commons. We used to rely on many incentives that kept, let's say, the quality of the median book above a certain level, or the quality of a certain broadcast above a certain level. And over time, we have fewer and fewer incentives to make good faith contributions into the epistemic commons rather than try to, in a variety of ways, capitalize on the epistemic commons. Exactly. Like we might want to increase our ad revenue. We might want to, pursue our career and the development of our career, even if it means a certain amount of intellectual dishonesty in an academic context. We might make decisions with regard to algorithmic feeds where the information presented to the user is not the information that is most useful to them or best for them, but the information that keeps them checking their app, right? So these many small decisions together produce an erosion of our common body of knowledge. I think one of the beautiful things about generative AI so far has been, I almost view it as this very beautiful last monument of a great civilization where, the global body of text, once you run through it, once you run the sum total of all the text that's been produced so far, you get a pretty competent undergrad writer. That's how I describe like a ChatGPT or a Claude. They're actually balanced relatively. They sometimes make stuff up, but on that they write not too badly, and they're getting better and better at being accurate. But in a way, they're giving us the gold standard best answer from this corpus of human writing, right?
I mean, you could argue that it's the models. There's still scope for the models to improve. So yes, the corpus of text is fixed, but
the models might improve.
The models might improve and get better at inferring what you really mean, etc., or drawing threads of.
My claim would be the quality of the corpus of text is going to decline.
Right. Well, especially as I'm hearing that because now all the data that is available. I mean, probably not all books. Let's be real here. Not all written books are now have been digitized yet. So there's actually a large repository of very high quality text there that arguably should be fed in, and that hasn't yet. However,
that's a one-time gain.
That is a one-time gain, yes. But I mean, it should be quite a big step change. But what I've been hearing is that companies are now looking into synthetic data. And that sets off a lot of alarm bells because basically, okay, we've run out of internet to scrape. Let's come up with more synthetic text with which to train our models further. But it's like, isn't that like garbage in, garbage out in a like horrifying feedback loop? I mean, again, I'm sure they're thinking about this, but it seems, if there's like we need better ways of sourcing meaningful information and knowledge as if we're going to be feeding into these AIs that are then going to be useful for us. But yeah, that's an interesting way of putting it as a like last monument.
I mean, it's a summary, right? We have written the Spark Notes on our civilization, and we can query ChatGPT to get the Spark Notes version of our civilization. TLDR did not read, right? The TLDR of our civilization is in every answer to every prompt you might ask of a modern generative AI. And, the question is, maybe the TLDR is good enough for us to get by, but to contribute to that corpus, to continue either the scientific or the philosophical written tradition that doesn't exist. And because of that, I mean, possibly it's truly obsolete. Possibly video, possibly, generated AI processing can substitute all of those knowledge transfers that used to be oriented around practice that had written output, but I doubt it. So for that reason, I expect the breakdown of law, right? Law is perhaps one of the last remnants where we are a writing-based civilization. I talked about the breakdown of science. We could talk about the breakdown of cultural instruction through writing. Arguably, this is one funny way in which we are less Protestant and more Catholic. So in the 19th century, if you had emotional problems, you would try to read an insightful novel about the human condition, or you would try to read material to help you regulate your feelings.
So like Dostoevsky or?
Exactly,
okay.
Something like that, yeah. The novel was super popular because it was a psychological aid. We talk about entertainment, but really what we should be talking about is self-medication with information. So that's why it was super popular, why novels could be even addicting. People talked about addiction to novels in the 19th century. And in the 20th century, we discovered that confession works wonderfully. So we secularized it and we called it therapy. So you have a high status person and they talk to you about your problems and you give them some tribute, and this relationship is sustained. And so that's my joke, right? We went from a book-based civilization like Protestant to priest-based civilization, Catholic confession, secularized as therapy. But anyway, let's say that our emotional self-regulation has somewhat broken, whether it's because of new developments or because old technologies just don't work anymore, old social technologies. That's an open question. And then I talked about how economic competition is considered almost unfair in a deep way, right? Even, for example, and there are problems with doing business with China, but I note to myself that TikTok definitely disproved the narrative that Chinese companies could not make compelling apps for users or compelling software for users. Now, maybe we still ban it here in the United States, but I think the fact that TikTok was successful really spooked many people in Silicon Valley. And the first impulse wasn't, we're going to build an even better app to displace TikTok. The first impulse was, well, this comes from a communist country. Surely their government has its fingers all over it. Let's ban it. I saw I had hundreds of conversations where this was sort of the first impulse.
But I mean, there was evidence, to be fair, that the app has all these backdoors in
Sure.
it.
Do American apps have all of these backdoors?
Supposedly fewer than TikTok. They were finding that it was scraping your clipboard of your phone, for example, copy paste and so on.
Why is the solution to that not a better American TikTok?
Sure. I mean, I would argue that there's the reciprocity problem with China. China's banned all the American apps from its app store. Why are we allowing a Chinese app?
Well, not all of them, right? Like Amazon could operate in China.
Sure, but the point is it's banned all of the social media ones, for example. So I think that unto itself. Like, you do need to have some degree of reciprocity.
I'm not even arguing that TikTok should not be banned. I'm just saying that there are signs that we are uncomfortable with economic competition, and there are, politically speaking, I think sort of law currently remains this thing where it's become ever more load bearing, right? The US is an ever more lawyer run society. We could joke that America is a word cell society if we use the kind of dumb meme.
And in some ways, it's like by relying more heavily on law, it's kind of the equivalent of running to teacher.
It is running to teacher, but it also means all the other systems have broken down, right?
Because it's the last remaining thing.
It's the last remaining thing. And then if ever we have generative AI excel at law, we will have a wonderful period of cheap and high quality representation for everyone, followed 1 to 2 generations later by a much reduced human legal tradition. So in a way, we will fossilize it. Well, because that service will displace the economic niche of a lawyer. And eventually, the niche, the socioeconomic niche of a Supreme Court justice. Can you imagine a Supreme Court justice that has not had 60 years of reasoning in their own head about legal arguments, but in fact has 60 years of clicking yes on a suggested text?
Horrifying. Again, lost tacit knowledge.
Exactly. And even if it's not the Supreme Court justice, if it's their clerk, that's the same thing really, even if it's their junior research staff. And again, the result is sort of like perhaps eating the epistemic seed corn. Now, possibly, again, eventually the AI is just good enough to be some sort of virtual person in our world. Maybe we're comfortable outsourcing law to artificial intelligence. But at that point, it's really not our civilization anymore. And at that point, in a way, the Enlightenment has ended, right? The project of the Enlightenment was supposed to be human reason exploring society and re-engineering the systems and incentives for this kind of the benefit of all, right? That was at least the pretense of that project. And all of these things like representative government, the scientific method, even market competition, and at other times enlightened central planning, these were all ideas coming from that philosophy. And we return now to the haunted world, the world where the machine says no, where the machine says yes, and we don't really know who builds the machines. We don't really know whether they work or not. I'm not even horrified about the potential of an AI takeoff or AI actually being in charge. I'm horrified of us becoming so superstitious about our machines that we develop a priesthood of the AI long before the AI is actually capable of running our society.
Treating it as an oracle when it doesn't deserve to be.
Our minds might use good enough year after year, even if good enough gets worse and worse, right? Like you can have a very cheap, low quality good can often displace, a higher quality, more expensive good. That's okay. But when it comes to the epistemic commons, there's like fewer and fewer reasons to do a good job. And it's not something you can legislate. Not really. I feel like legislation at most is like putting Band-Aids on like this wound where we're bleeding out. A well-maintained commons that once was just honestly maintained by people who inherently cared about intellectual integrity, right? It's hard to remember, but we used to care about intellectual integrity in this almost religious way. The important thing as an individual in an Enlightenment-style society was that you cultivated these virtues because this is the means through which the world gets better. So you would do it even when it wasn't economically the best thing to do, when it wasn't the socially best thing to do. You did it because you basically believed that this is how we, humanity, make the world better. And the step of we will remove this and put this responsibility on the machine is a very, in a way, reasonable one. But as soon as that's done, all of these reasons to maintain your ability to process information in the world, they go away. And the whole like house of cards collapses. And then you have far fewer people who have this built up machinery, this incentive to do this. And I claim that will feed right back into diminished manufacturing capacity and actually slower progress on fundamental algorithmic breakthroughs. Like every time I talk to someone who makes on me a strong impression that they're going to drive AI further, it's never the sleek marketing guy. It's always some Israeli or ex-Soviet mathematician weirdo that has strange theories of metaphysics, strange theories of math, and strange bets on AI. When I meet someone like that, I know that I met someone that might bring AI forward. When I don't think I've met someone that will bring AI forward is when they talk about it like it's a plane delivering cargo, right? The literal cargo cult. We are very close to saying that we don't need to know how to build a much better artificial intelligence. The next model will deliver the cargo. It's going to bring us nice things, and we're just going to enjoy them. No, I'm talking here about the cargo cults where, the assumption is that material goods come from, planes filled with US soldiers.
Right. So it sounds like what you're getting at is there's this kind of ossification of society.
The simulacra of reason is beating out reason at all levels, right? At the most elite levels and the most popular levels.
So is this just an inevitable process? Is it like part of the cycle of every civilization? Have there been any that have broken the way out of this cycle, or at least gotten close to it?
I think that a certain loss of particular traditions of knowledge is probably deeply behind almost every civilization that has ever collapsed. And the reasons is it is always outcompeted in a certain socio-political game, right? So for example, having an excellent understanding of the Roman legal code at one point was an excellent way to achieve power in the Roman Republic. That becomes obsolete when the correct way to achieve power is command of a Roman legion, say crossing the Rubicon, right? That becomes obsoleted when the correct way to win power is no longer not even being a good military commander, but it is winning court intrigue games and assassinating any general that happens to be too successful. We could name Belisarius in the empire of Justinian, the Eastern Roman Empire, or commanders in the 4th century AD under Emperor Honorius, right, who would just kill successful generals. Because why? A successful general can be a threat to the supreme power. So we have a certain time in almost every civilization's history where a particular skill or a particular tradition of knowledge, be it military, economic, scientific, spiritual, social, right, urban, where developing it is the best way to achieve success and recognition in society. And the tipping point of diminishing returns comes sooner or later, right? When the S-curve is exhausted. And at that point, you go from positive sum games to negative sum games. And as soon as your civilization starts playing negative sum games, that is infectious and spreads rapidly through an institution. If the best way to succeed in a major government bureaucracy today is to treat it in bad faith, if the best way to succeed in the media space is to treat it in bad faith, if the best way to succeed in academia is to treat it in bad faith, wow, what's left?
Right.
Right? And I'm not even done. I could go further, right? If the best way to run a startup is to treat it in bad faith, and the best way to do it is to hype it up at all times, even if you know your technical fundamentals are sketchy, then, maybe we'll all become, in Silicon Valley, we will all become Elizabeth Holmes. Maybe we've already become Elizabeth Holmes, right? And we don't even know it because who would point it out, right?
It's just so default.
It is very default. And that's why I think that how to break out of that as a civilization? Well, sometimes you can take very extreme measures, which I think can prolong the existence of a society, right? The creation of a completely new city that comes to be a new elite center is surprisingly effective. Why? Well, human beings are biased against moving. Most Roman noble families did not want to follow Constantine and his weird bunch of religious freaks out into a random Greek city, formerly Byzantium, then Constantinople. Yet even 50 or 100 years ago, they found themselves radically disempowered compared to the new Senate that was set up. There was a separate Senate set up in Constantinople and a new military apparatus and a new taxation apparatus focused on the eastern provinces. And of course, the pagan state-backed religion gave way to the Christian state-backed religion. So that was a transfer of power there. There wasn't a direct fight. There was just this sudden like change of where coordination happens. I think cities need to be understood as like physical embodiments, instantiations, incarnations of coordination. Which street you live on, shockingly important. Which offices are close to each other, shockingly important. When the US was like structured a bit more honestly, there was a Department of War rather than a Department of Defense, and it was in the same building as the State Department. I guarantee you, if your generals and diplomats run into each other in the hallway, you will be in fewer stupid wars. As soon as you physically separate them to opposite sides of a river or opposite cities, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. And actually, you might have basically exiled someone to a place of irrelevance. It's not just, Roman history that has this phenomena. Russian history has this phenomena. When the czars wanted to be absolutist in Russia and have great power over the high nobility, they moved out of Moscow to St. Petersburg, leaving the Moscow nobility behind and irrelevant. So I think I would be very optimistic if any major Western country today created a new capital with a new university with a new special economic zone. I think I would be extremely optimistic because that would mean that the old negative sum institutions are left to play their negative sum game, which is self-marginalizing, and you immediately are starting something that at least locally in that city can be a positive sum game.
A new flower blooming. Yeah, I mean, this maps very closely onto what Margaret Wade, who was a recent guest, was talking about. She is trying to get these, she calls them charter cities. And presumably this is, are you referring to literally like building a new city from scratch? Or is it like repurposing a new city and saying, look, we're going to try out a new set of laws?
Honestly, it's good to have a new city almost from scratch, though it can be an existing city if a completely new industry is instantiated there.
Any potential ones in the US do you think that could fit that bill?
I think the United States is
too calcified?
No. I think it's actually fairly lucky as far as Western countries go. I think the demand for urbanization here outstrips supply. There's still like 50 to 100 million Americans that if they could move to a big city and have a high-paying job, would happily do so. I claim this is no longer true of, say, Italy or Spain, right? The countryside's already emptied out. The second-tier cities are emptied out. Slowly, even the first-tier cities will start to empty out. Say like Madrid or in Catalonia or Milan or whatever.
Empty out to where though?
Just population decline, and also to even higher tier cities, right? Why live in Madrid if you can live in Brussels? If you can live in Brussels, why live in Brussels if you can live in London? And why live in London if you can live in San Francisco or New York or Texas?
Right.
So the other method, short of creating new cities, which I think is it very much gives you like a sort of a societal reset. The other possibility is pursuing a new field of development. So if your society had basically been occupying its elites through like a religious system, for example, opening up a commercial way for elites to pursue games, right? So people who are very ambitious, who are very skilled, if they come into an environment that is a positive sum, like learning environment even for them, if most of someone's career is positive sum, well, they will develop positive sum skills. If most of someone's career is negative sum, they're going to develop negative sum skills. Who do you wish to be surrounded by? So if maybe, say, an extracted, somewhat decadent, overdeveloped religion, such as some people would say the Catholic Church was in the late medieval period, encounters, a vibrant meritocratic, bureaucratic sort of state where it's a young bureaucracy, not yet dysfunctional, like say maybe the French state was or the British one, power very naturally shifts to the other one, and civilization as a whole changes, but it becomes a positive sum game again. And then maybe later on, say, religion as it persists in the 18th or 19th century becomes positive sum again, because they are no longer the predominant trendsetters of society, and they have been sort of emptied over time and starved. The negative sum game is almost cauterized into this field that is ever more marginalized. And at one point, it's flimsy, and the negative sum sort of games are easily overturned by new positive sum games. My hope had been for almost the last 10 years that tech would prove to be the positive sum game of our civilization, which forged an elite trained on positive sum games that would then go and, I don't know, revitalize legacy industry, the manufacture of atoms, or maybe revitalize government, or maybe revitalize culture and media. And while we see a few excellent examples of this, we're not seeing anywhere near enough to overcome the extremely negative trends in any of the branches of government, in any of the major professions and industries outside of tech.
Do you think that is because the game that is developing the tech itself is too already Molochian and negative sum, or like at least?
I think it was very positive sum in a lot of ways.
But again, it's still beholden to a lot of these misaligned incentives, right? They're still optimizing for, well, we've got to be profitable, we've got to raise our next funding round. Who's raised the biggest funding round? There's a lot of sort of dick swinging and so on. Is that the reason why tech is being is insufficient to write this, or is it just because it's like slapping a band-aid on a rotten or like a festering wound that is much deeper, like at a systemic level?
I think that to a great extent, tech is very inward-looking. It does not look at the rest of society very much. I think if it looked at the rest of society, they would just choose to do many things very differently, many things that are easily preventable, right? Easily can be improved upon. Well, let's just go for a little bit and acknowledge that back in 2009 or 2010, the search engine was a wonderful innovation that let you think about the world in a completely new way. And honestly, if I could choose today between having a 2010 era search engine or a 2020s era generative text model, I would choose the search engine in a heartbeat. Yeah. I think currently search engines are terrible, but they've become much, much worse than they were 10 years ago. The median quality of the information and source I could find in 2010 was very high. If I wanted to find, a high-grade crackpot autist who was completely correct about some small niche thing in 2010, that was easy. I believe those still exist, but if I try to find one today online, I don't find them. And how much prompting would I have to give to a model to have it say, I don't know, replace Gwern, right? Gwern.net. It's impossible. I cannot prompt the LLM to give me Gwern. I could find Gwern in 2010 Google.
Right. If you're a new person, you're not finding them now.
You're not finding Gwern in 2024 with your search engine. So, okay. There was a massive positive information revolution in the 90s and 2000s that actually counteracted and corrected for somewhat the decline of academia. Without the internet, it's not clear to me at all that the replication crisis would have even happened. I'm not even sure we would have figured that out.
It wouldn't have been a crisis in the first place, or we would not have...
We would not have diagnosed it. We wouldn't have diagnosed it. We would have just believed the bullshit studies. And we have believed it for decades to come, right? Which is a thing, nature allows that to happen. There's nothing just universe that prevents us from being deluded for a century or more, right? But you challenged me to say what could tech do better. So I'm going to give as concrete an answer as I can what tech could do better today after having acknowledged immense positive contributions. Like Wikipedia again, it's not only a TLDR of everything our society has achieved, it was actually very productive in the Enlightenment sense because people would use Wikipedia, reason about it, and the community of Wikipedia editors, which of course they had their own political biases, but they maintained rigor and excellence for basically social incentive reasons. So in a way, Wikipedia was closer to old peer review than bureaucratic new peer review is, right? So I think Wikipedia is a great example of technology entering our society and picking up a function that, 200 years ago would have literally been down to the editors of encyclopedias who at the time thought that they were transforming society by giving everyone access to knowledge. And in a way, probably they were. Still, acknowledging all these, we could talk about 10 other positive contributions, but acknowledging those, what can they do today? I think the best things for tech to do, unfortunately, are not the most profitable. I think no matter what you do, the margins for software are always better than hardware. We have saturated much of what can be done with software. We should be pursuing many more hardware improvements. At the very least, I would wish to see top tech talent allocated with significant funding to optimizing the factory floor the way we have tried to optimize the newsfeed. Can you imagine a big data approach to manufacturing? That's real automation. That would be remarkable, right? I believe further that a lot of tech wealth could be deployed in a very classic way that is not understood very well, which is socially responsible philanthropy. I think we live in an era where there is no for-profit reason to give accurate information. I think what should be done, and ideally the billionaires should be diverse in their thinking. I think if every billionaire basically funded a private blog with their favorite thinkers, and they took pride that these are different and distinct from what all of their friends are funding, I think those could be very positive nonprofit organizations. Keep them small, keep them diverse, have them be these sort of like, focused on excellence, have them critique each other basically for social status points because the monetization just seems too tricky. I think that could work extremely well, especially if one cauterized the sort of like New York media scene, by hiring former and current New York Times journalists. That's how you go from being early wired to being late wired.
You mean the magazine? The
magazine, yeah. Per se, I don't know, Mike Solana's Pirate Wires is, as soon as they start hiring professional journalists, it's over.
Knowing Mike, I don't think they're going to do that. He's got... but at the same time, the incentives are there, right? You want the big names, so yeah.
And we could go further, and I think that I'm glad that, say, Gary Tan is undertaking some amount of, let's call it, YIMBY activism in the Bay Area. Probably, if you're a leading YC, you correctly identify that Bay Area rents and lack of construction are actually eating up a lot of the money one invests into software companies. But I really do think that a new look at urban politics in the United States would do much to fix the problems of society. And it is somewhere where I think technocratic solutions just would work. So again, the talent, the IQ of the industry is there, and tools could be leveraged, right? Information tools.
Like what though? What would be the technocratic solution to these policy bottlenecks?
Literally spend any effort at all to try to change the policies. So in other words, I'm saying, I wish tech elites were as politically active in our society as journalists would like to pretend that they are.
I see. Given they're getting called that anyway, they might as well do it.
They might as well do it. There's no negative to the reputation. In fact, maybe they are actively punished because they're not doing it. Who do you critique? You critique the person where there's no consequence to critiquing them at all, right? And with regard to, the, leveraging of the unique expertise, right? I think the space of organizing voters, even the voters themselves being organized, right? So not even top-down organization, just giving voters tools for them to organize themselves. Massive disruption opportunities. People have totally stopped talking about digital democracy and stuff like that. That was very popular in the early 2000s.
Right,
it's gone. Well, mostly because you can't really easily make money off of it. But the positive returns to fixing a country's politics would be immense, right? Even eventually financially. Like if you live in a well-functioning country, so many things are much easier business-wise.
You wrote this book on great founder theory, which I'll try and paraphrase, is essentially that some of the greatest civilizations or institutions in history were off the back of either a singular or a small number of incredibly talented, forward-thinking individuals. And that was an integral part of sort of our humanity's march of progress. What role do you think that could play in trying to right the ship of current Western civilization?
Well, to restate great founder theory as I formulated it, it is a variant on the so-called great man approach that historians in the 20th century critiqued in favor of trends, forces, and so on. And the crux of it is that I believe innovations in social technology, that is human coordination, and that is human organization, are usually the work of an individual or very small groups when they're first prototyped and introduced to society, but once introduced to society, have a footprint that can last thousands of years. And very simple examples would be, even, we talked about Confucian civilization, Christianity, all of these things. Well, organized religions usually have a founder, right? Sometimes it's not the founder it's credited to. We could debate about the true origin and development of, say, something like the Catholic Church, or something like the sort of Confucian strategy of we're going to study the classics and then we're going to travel around the Warring States period China, trying to convince the princes of these states that they need very high-skilled civil administrators, and then we're going to run that little statelet well, and eventually that statelet is going to be all of China. So, and by the way, that is literally sort of Confucius's life and the life of his students. They were just these wandering scholars trying to explain why they would do a good job of running these things. And shockingly, it worked, right? You wouldn't think that you can have, sword-wielding rulers be talked out of running things, but it's only when you remember how tedious it is actually to run things where you realize how easily that can work.
Would the founding fathers of the US be an example of great founders?
Yes, very much so. I think that it is hard to deny that they're definitely one of the peaks of sort of Enlightenment era civilization. Their aspirations were not limited, right? If you see, Thomas Jefferson, like editing the Bible to be more rational, or Benjamin Franklin being very interested in, science, natural science, that was not unique. That was actually common in their milieu. And they definitely debated for real and wrote pamphlets not just to persuade the public, but to persuade each other. And they had vigorous disagreements about...
They actually wrote essays.
They actually wrote essays.
They were discovering.
And they gathered together. And, if I told you that, we're going to gather 300 of the smartest and most powerful Americans today, and they're going to decide what the next government will look like. That sounds a little bit scary, a little bit exciting, a little bit impossible, but that is literally the Constitutional Convention as it happened, which was technically illegal according to the previous laws. But once you gathered a few hundred of the most prominent Americans, who could really say no, right? It was impossible to say no, right? And there's this very fundamental way where the system has sort of run very well. It's clear that the United States is, arguably like the greatest political system so far in human history, just in terms of its wealth, power, and influence. I'm not going to go into, its many moral virtues and many moral failings, but it's surely, one of the most powerful countries to have ever existed. And that is definitely the sort of thing that will put Americans in the history books next to the Romans, the Chinese, and so on. But to go back to sort of the great founder theory perspective, like the founding of religions, the founding of states, the founding of new types of economic organizations, right? The founding of new cities. You look at the history of it, often it's like very, very concentrated, and they come into existence very rapidly. You sometimes have long periods of stasis, followed by a very short period of development, followed by a much slower rate of change.
Presumably, and by short, you mean short
one
enough
generation.
Exactly, short enough for a single lifetime, which would suggest that it was basically one person or a small number of
people which
working together to sort of design new rules for a game, new rules of the game.
Exactly, which is precisely what we saw with the American Revolution. It's precisely what we saw with the big religious transformations of history and big military or economic transformations of history. So having said all of this, I think that in the past, whenever you have a society trapped in negative-sum games, it is precisely on the creation of new social technologies where the hope rests for positive-sum games. So I think today we are hopefully generating enough people who have the potential to be great founders, that there will be a transformation in some sectors of our society that goes us from a losing streak where we're sort of living off our inheritance, where maybe, the numbers are still going up, and maybe even the first derivative is positive, but the second derivative has gotten very negative. So we need to break out of that spiral, and I think that can only happen through such individuals.
To push back on great founder theory, I wonder whether, because presumably with history, there's going to be these sort of blind spots and biases in the way that the information has been recorded. Like, we love to think of things through stories, right? And what usually happens in a story, that there's a singular protagonist, and we can go, okay, well, they did that and they wanted this and therefore this happened. Stories aren't very good at telling, and nor is written history, telling the story, like telling of situations where it's kind of a decentralized bottom-up type thing that emerges. So I worry whether it's like taking a kind of overly deterministic sort of view of history, or at least downplaying the effects of emergent things that have happened. What would you say to that?
I would say that definitely there are many very important emergent phenomena that have happened through the course of history. In fact, it's very useful to study those and very useful to try to model those great trends. Having said that, though, I think that precisely because of our limits of modeling a very complex reality, we have to focus on the most explanatory bits, right? And I think that while great founder theory is not supposed to be a total theory of all social phenomena, it does a rather good job of tracking the following: rise and fall of organized religions, rise and fall of political systems, the great technological or economic transformations of several eras. And if you got those three, I think you're doing pretty well, right? And I think that so much of what we would consider bottom-up change, right? So much of it rests on changes in the macro environment, right? It's sort of like, in a desert, when the climate pattern shifts and the rain starts to fall more frequently. Of course, the seedlings growing everywhere, sprouting, and eventually the trees growing. Of course, that's a decentralized phenomena. But it might be just a side effect of a single weather pattern changing and there being an extra monsoon there, right? So if you consider something like the introduction of a new code of law, of course, the work, people working under incentives of the code of law that's decentralized, right? People suddenly have an incentive to open or create a small business. They create a small business. That wasn't centrally planned. However, the transformation from, say, a Soviet-styled planned economy to an open competitive economy, that had to be a centralized change. People might argue that, but the Soviet Union, we can focus on that concrete example. Soviet Union fell for this or that inevitable reason. As far as we can tell, it was sort of just this coup d'etat of Boris Yeltsin versus Gorbachev, where the constituent republics, the heads of those republics, who are already very powerful people in the Soviet Union, sort of got together and they're like, do we even need Gorbachev? Do we even need the central system? Let's split this thing apart. And when they did, this meant liberation for many of the Baltic states. This meant a chance at independent development for Ukraine. But for many places, like, the initial very powerful person that made that decision just stayed in charge as dictator, as happened in a lot of Central Asian republics. So history offers many, many natural experiments where we get to see, because consider, if it's truly, the collapse of the Soviet Union was truly such a bottom-up phenomena of like freedom versus dictatorship, surely those Central Asian dictatorships should have been basically impossible. Like the same bottom-up that overthrew the Soviet Union should have overthrown them, right, in term. And maybe one could argue, there was a delayed reaction. It was, it had to wait until the so-called colored revolutions in the 2000s. But by that point, we're dealing with the effects of the internet. Society has changed so much. Look, that's 20 years after the fall of the Soviet Union. I think it's a very tenuous argument that that's what happened, right?
So what do you suspect the common traits are that is shared by great founders, and what type of personality traits would be necessary for great founders or game designers, whatever you want to call them, that would be necessary to help society out of its current funk today?
Well, those are two huge questions, and you've asked many huge questions today, which I struggle to answer.
Doing very well.
I strive to answer. Yeah. But to focus on maybe the first one, I think that nearly everyone has to thread the very delicate needle of being capable of disagreeing with nearly everyone in your society without needing to disagree with everyone.
As in not having the personal need of egoic attachment to it, or what?
Anyone who is always attached to disproving what everyone else is saying will never be able to work with other people well enough to transform even a single organization, let alone an industry or a society or a civilization. You have to be, so the people are sometimes somewhat megalomaniacal, but they can't be too detached from reality, because with detachment from reality comes a lack of ability to survey the landscape, right? There has to be this, like, this sort of threaded needle where they, either for deluded reasons or good reasons, believe they personally have the moral authority to transform society. They might believe that they're chosen by God, or that all that matters is technological progress and I'm making technological progress happen, or that, I'm producing a wealthier society and my opponents are sort of like, the Randian villains of this story. Something has to be there that morally justifies first to yourself and then to your close allies' action, because human defaults tend toward inaction. And I think we are extremely good as a species of bullying each other out of doing things. I think this is an underemphasized fact of human nature, that we are very much, we are very much a species that does not like the tall poppy. We try to cut it down. We're sort of fascinated in an almost salacious way when someone gets away with being exceptional. We kind of worship them. We overfocus on them. And when they slip up just a little, we're vicious. We're ready to pounce. So our excitement is more kind of this, it's very unflattering, I think. I think we can be quite abusive to the exceptional people in our societies, and always have been as a species, because the rewards are very high, possibly of successfully being such a person, but the punishment is always there. The most dangerous profession you could have in the Roman Empire was being emperor. Your odds of a violent death were very, very high. And I think in the modern United States, the most dangerous profession you can have is actually still technically the president. Your odds of being assassinated are, 3%? That's pretty dangerous. There are few jobs where I have a 3% chance of being murdered. Maybe like a military vet when the US is actually in a serious war. Maybe that comes close, but I don't even think that comes close. So that tells you something interesting, right? Even though we're much less violent than Rome ever was, or Sumerian society ever was, we're a very peaceful society. It tells you that there's an exposure for violence, which leads me to feature number 2. I think there's something about sheer tolerance for stress, sheer physiological tolerance for cortisol, that has to be much higher in that type of person. And then the third feature is the ability to have sustained long-term allies. And again, this is a place where a good story often is just true. If you examine independent or hostile accounts for discussing the life of, say, Muhammad, or of Julius Caesar, even their enemies acknowledge that they have close allies who follow them for most of their lives, who they can rely on, who they can confide secrets in, who they could even voice doubts to, because no individual, no matter, again, how effectively megalomaniacal or how high their stress resilience is, can process all the information truly. All they can do is be sort of a clearinghouse for the cross information of a trusted small group. And even the most caricatured historical figures, like let's look at Napoleon, right? He relied greatly on his military commanders and on his legal experts. And I wouldn't say that he was necessarily a great founder unless, say, French civilization endures for another 500 years, because the code of law that he promulgated, Napoleon's code of law, is actually the basis of civil law all over continental Europe. So if that system proves to be successful, we could retroactively say that Napoleon was a defeated military commander, but despite that, still a great founder if he successfully introduced the code of law. His key ability was, despite his cult of personality, to still have close allies and people that he could work with for years or decades.
I mean, it's clear that some people do have more of those traits. I know some of them personally. As you were going through that list, I'm like, yeah, that fits the bill on a number of particularly powerful CEOs or whoever, people who are they're just incredibly resilient and they aren't afraid of challenging opinions and so on. But it does seem to be the case that certainly fame and, to a large degree, the power that comes with it, or just power even without fame, will eventually fry your brain. I have not yet seen anyone whose brain has not been at least partially fried by that. So how to manage that if we want to find people who are able to think through these, hold these incredibly complex issues in their head sufficiently and design structures and have enough of a cult of personality to bring people who will help them bring these things to life, how to stop them from then getting drunk on their own success?
Well, there's certainly ways to ameliorate that problem, but let me perhaps propose that in the big picture, this is less of a problem than we often fear. If through the course of revolutionizing an industry, through the course of Steve Jobs giving society the iPhone, right? Or through the course of Buddha launching, a self-help movement that in the West we'll call a religion, let's say, or Charlemagne breaking the constant tribal conflicts and producing the system we think of as feudalism, they go a little bit insane. I mean, that sure isn't nice for them. It probably isn't nice for people towards the end of their career, but from the perspective of civilization as a whole, they've already delivered their payload. In biology, we're often like, well, after you reproduce, it sure is unpleasant where your body falls apart, but it's what natural selection has selected for. And unfortunately, maybe it is the cost of this process of social creation, the creation of a new social technology. There has to be, you can't just write about your utopia. You have to build a prototype community that actually carries out these ideas. And look, your prototype community could be, Plato's Academy. It could be Aristotle's Academy, right? It could be Plato's school. It could be a new city-state. It could be a new religion. Once you've built it, it is bigger than you. It outlasts you. And even if you do other things that are bad for society or bad for you or those close to you, I think society has been vastly improved by your presence, by your existence, by that initial act of creation. I could be a little bit provocative and, point out that, a scientific analogy here would be maybe Fritz Haber, who, very important for the Haber-Bosch process. It's how we create all our artificial fertilizers. This guy in the early 1900s, I think probably responsible for at least half of the yields of the so-called Green Revolution, which allowed us to feed billions of people. So really saved many, many millions of lives. On the other hand, though, also, worked for the government in World War I and made poison gas. And I'm sure that killed a few thousand or tens of thousands of people. And then on net, it sure would be nice if we could have a clean utilitarian hero that just did the farming revolution and didn't do the poison gas. But really, he was the kind of person that was up for either and was convinced that this was sort of both good, right? He believed in my side should win the war, not the other. Chemistry will revolutionize all aspects of life. And really, that sort of positive and negative thing, I think often goes together. So my argument would be the following. I think that as a society, we need stem cells. In the body of society, we need the stem cells that go around the body and become new skin, new hair, new nerve cells, right? Highly adaptable, right? And if we downregulate the amount of such stem cells, we will age and we will die as a society. If we upregulate it, yes, also the risk of cancer goes up. But on net, I think we really need renewal that badly. So I really do think that the sort of power issue, I think so much more evil in the world has happened through something not being done than through something being done. It's very lopsided. Even if we put Genghis Khan and all the terrible conquerors of history on the pile, and we put them next to all the city builders who are also often conquerors, to be honest. We just talked about Alexander. Raised many cities, built many cities. On net, probably good for humanity. Probably the Library of Alexandria was worth it.
But it's a complicated equation.
But it's a complicated equation. But if we put those people on a pile and then we add cultural reform and scientific reform and weird groups pursuing various aspects of knowledge, I think it clearly comes on the side of, on net, human agency is good. And in the bottom line, when we talk about power, we're talking about human agency, right? Maybe it is the case that humans can only endure so much agency. And with too much agency, too much optionality, our brain goes awry. but I think fundamentally we are better off with a higher agency set point than a lower one. We are nowhere near the frontier of crazy, irresponsible people running around. We're very close to saturated on extremely boring, very parasitical, very inactive, extractive elites, right? So we're close to saturation on the senescent cells. We're nowhere near on saturation on like new crazy people running around.
You could argue, though, that we are now in a world where through technology, and particularly information technology, that such power is becoming increasingly democratized. So, well, I'm curious because, like, I just had Nick Bostrom on. His thesis on the vulnerable world hypothesis talks about, for the most part, most technologies are great, and that's good that we are democratizing them. But sometimes you pull out a bad technology that is actually incredibly damaging, and if you democratize that and make it available to everyone, then the individual, the ability for the individual to fuck everything up has increased. So, wouldn't that? You're saying that actually the rate of democratization of power is insufficient compared to the stasis.
Well, the way I would propose it is that individuals or small groups wielding power, pursuing agentic agendas, happens much less than we think it does, right? Most elites, extremely passive, extremely homeostasis seeking, right? Only protecting, I used the phrase class interest or class privilege previously.
They've got power and they just want to keep it.
Exactly. And they want to give it to people like them, right? And it's not explicitly thought of. It's just like, oh, I get along so well with this person. And we met in college. And which
They're
college
really nice
was
to
that?
me, and my family
we were
liked
in the
them.
same frat. And it was the frat was the Skull and Bones, right? It's very not self-aware. And people sometimes hallucinate and imagine that there are agentic elites elsewhere. And then you're like, but wait, I've just talked to all the top academics of this country. I've just talked to several people who are, members of parliament, and I've talked to the most prominent businessmen. And in a small country like maybe Slovenia, or maybe a little bit bigger like Britain, where are these agentic movers and shakers? Like everyone assumes that someone else is out there improving society. But really, if you're in an elite position and your social circle is in an elite position, and you see most of them are not doing much, that means no one in your society is doing much. Okay, with that point sort of out of the way, to address what I think is sort of there in your question with regard to democratization, I am skeptical of the democratization of our society. For a variety of reasons, I think our society is very oligarchic, and power has actually concentrated in these sort of like ossified, stagnant, non-agentic centers, where the main mode of exercising power today, say in the European Union or in the United States, and honestly any large country, is the veto. In the European Union, the most powerful person is a French-speaking bureaucrat in Brussels that you've never heard of, who says no to something being done. And in the United States, there's so many reasons not to do things, right? At the federal level, at the sort of political level. And we are saturated in these various elites. They are not very agentic. They are powerful, but because they don't do anything, they just forbid things, you can never call gotcha on the power. We don't recognize forbidding something as an abuse of power. We recognize doing something as an abuse of power.
In case it goes wrong, yeah.
And that's kind of messed up.
Definitely. It's an asymmetry of information, essentially.
Very fundamentally. Yeah. And then we were just talking about the failure of the epistemic commons. I think there's no way that power is more democratized now than it was 20 years ago because, my phone is not my ally in making sense of the world. It is actively trying to run basically psyops on me at all times and all places. And, by carrying around this phone or an Apple phone, if people prefer those, you are basically giving away your location at all times. You are basically recording every conversation you have. And while you might trust the very inert and uncreative elites that run the big software companies or that run the government agencies that can legally demand any data your big software organizations have, your companies, your nonprofit foundations, whatever, while you might trust their inactivity, the fact is you as an individual are vastly more transparent to any bureaucracy today than you were at any previous point in human history. In no previous point in human history could a bureaucracy gather as much information on you as an individual as they can today? And I claim that you as an individual have less of an ability to gather information on the inner working of a bureaucracy today than even 10 years ago. I think even compliance with things like the Freedom of Information Act, right, have been much attenuated. And the idea that it is irresponsible for large bureaucracies to not keep accurate records, that's sort of gone away. And these software and information tools that an individual could use to study those organizations, they're not been developed. We've only developed ways to monetize and examine the individual. We've not developed the software tools to look at large bureaucracies. Ergo, over time, large bureaucracies are more powerful than individuals, and large bureaucracies, unless piloted by a live player, so like an active agentic individual, will come to be run by homeostasis-seeking, self-serving, rent-extracting oligarchies.
So it sounds really like what you're arguing for is we just need actually a higher complexity state.
We need greater risk tolerance. I would say we need greater risk tolerance for reform of major government institutions, and we need greater risk tolerance in terms of industry disruption, and we need greater intellectual risk tolerance where we encourage people and we try to sustain them socioeconomically in developing new ideas of how nature works and how society works.
What advice would you give to anyone watching who feels like they resonate with this idea of a great founder and want to try and be one themselves?
I mean, first off, it's very excellent to try to be one yourself. I just selfishly encourage you because we all benefit from the externalities on net. But secondly, I also propose perhaps finding a great founder and trying to be part of their team and trying to be a functional member of a small group might be a more practical first step. Where I think in our society, we've lost a lot of this idea of recognizing and valuing greatness in others. This is perhaps a way in which I might be slightly less individualist, like a lot of my philosophy can be described as this very hyper-individualist, maybe almost Nietzschean will to power. But one of the things I also believe is in valuing, appreciating, and supporting human excellence. I think there's an undersupply of people seeking out the most agentic people in society and attempting to enhance them and strengthen them and help them correct their flaws and assist them maybe with going a little bit less crazy or being a trusted team member and long-term associate. A part of lost Western social technology is, I think, actually the loss of a load-bearing type of friendship that once existed, right? Whether it be the sort of like scientific collegiality where you both care about the truth and you're actually collaboratively working towards it, whether it's the kind of, board when when the East India Company met to do, their business or whatever, a very trivial thing is that they would open the meetings with prayer because the pretense was that actually what we're trying to do here is work each other's salvation and we're just trying to do good work together. And only incidentally are we like super rich and making a lot of money and being super powerful. And I think the idea of valuing other individuals so much that you want to help them fully develop their potential, that is something that was there in the DNA of Western civilization. It was there even in classical civilization. If you read Plato and Aristotle on friendship, right? They elevate it to this level that we just don't understand. It's elevated even above romantic love in the writing, right? And I think that allowed very functional small groups to work together. So I would propose find someone in your life who you think has great potential and do your best to mentor them or assist them or learn from them or teach them to try to correct their flaws and like be constructive, right? Don't say no, say yes to things of others. And I think the adage of, there's no limit to the good you can do if you don't care who gets the credit will prove very true.
All right. So to finish up, I would love to ask you some rapid fire questions around geopolitical predictions, because you are an analyst. Ultimately, one of your main things you do is you run Bismarck Analysis, which is essentially an intelligence gathering resource?
Basically, private intelligence and a research and consulting firm. We also put out the weekly Bismarck Brief, which is, well received and has a very interesting set of subscribers. I certainly practice what I preach, right? I try to give accurate evaluations of the world. So fire away.
Okay. Percentage likelihood that TikTok gets removed from the App Store in the US by the end of 2025?
I think that the US regulatory apparatus moves slowly and the countermeasures are fairly effective. So I would say that about 20%.
Likelihood that Ukraine joins NATO by end of 2030?
Okay, I would put that at about 35%.
Likelihood that COVID was a lab leak?
75%, 80%, 80%, yeah.
Likelihood Netanyahu stands down by end of 2024?
I don't have an excellent model of Israeli domestic politics. I think a lot of the details there are opaque, mostly because of the very competent security services of the country. I would bet that it's likelier than not that Netanyahu endures just because he is such an effective politician, but with low confidence.
Likelihood that China invades Taiwan by end of 2026?
Fairly low. I would put it under 10%.
Finally, likelihood that Epstein killed himself?
15%.
Okay, it's pretty low. Awesome. Any other big predictions you'd like to make that you are very high confidence on?
Okay, well, that's an interesting challenge in its own right. I predict in 3 years, or actually, no, I predict in 5 years, most of us will still have a job and AI will not have fired us. Maybe it'll make our job much more boring, kind of lame and rote. But, I have a quip that says, it's impossible to automate fake jobs. I think our society has a high degree of jobs that only exist because of sort of regulatory and social needs, and that actually we have secretly already implemented UBI. It's called having a middle class job, and it's just sort of janky through all of these like hyper-regulated types of ways in which we redistribute wealth unofficially.
So you think that actually a lot of people going to an office is purely performative?
And I think it doesn't mean that they're having a good time. I'm just saying that our society has a political need for jobs that exceeds its economic need. And while AI advancements might well come to the point where they suppress the economic need or meet the economic need, they do nothing for the political need for jobs. I do think it's, for example, telling that when it comes to large tech companies, it's extremely unclear what the median software engineer does. I think you could easily go through every single major tech company and fire half of the software engineers, and you'd be okay. And the user wouldn't notice a big difference.
I mean, Elon did it with Twitter, right?
Elon did
75%, yeah.
Yeah. But, he had to know what he was doing for that. But I almost think that if you didn't know what you were doing and just magic 8-balled it and fired half of them, the other half would scramble to do that job pretty well. And if that's true in tech, which is actually a very demanding field, very rigorous, technically demanding, what does that say about so many other sectors of our society? I think we are inundated with make work that secretly is a type of work. It's just political work. We don't think of it as political work, but it kind of is, right? Like what's the point of having a large team of engineers if it makes the product worse? Well, it means that the manager of the engineering team claims greater authority, can claim like more credit, might advance inside the hierarchy. What's the point of a big tech company having 10,000 employees rather than 1,000 employees? It's sort of like, Mr. Congressman, we bring 10,000 high-paying jobs to California.
So it's a signaling thing again.
Exactly. And why do the elected officials care about whether there are 10,000 high-paying jobs in Austin? Well, that answers itself, doesn't it?
So it sounds like actually perhaps the most promising disruption could come through lifting the veil on the signaling game.
An effective accounting of the economy and politics would be a revolutionary act. And I think there's more effort that can be put to that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So So there we go, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in, and huge thanks to Samo for this conversation. In the show notes below are links to a lot of his writing. I really recommend taking a peruse. Also, if you want to keep your finger on the geopolitical pulse, do check out his weekly Bismarck brief. You can also give him a follow on Twitter. Lastly, quick request. Please, if you enjoyed this, give this podcast a good review on whatever platform you're listening on. I hate to ask, but it really helps. So anyway, thank you, and I will catch you next week.